The sun was dying over the prairie, bleeding out in long streaks of crimson and gold that stained the endless grassland, the color of old wounds. Wind came hard from the northwest, pushing dust and dry tumbleweed through the sage and rabbit brush that clung stubbornly to the parched earth near Buffalo Crossing. It was the kind of wind that warned of winter arriving early, the kind that could strip a man down to bone if he let it. And it carried with it the scent of distant rain that might never come. Chayton moved through the landscape as though he were woven from it. Buckskin tunic worn soft at the elbows and stained with use. Moccasins silent on the cracked ground, a plain rawhide band holding back hair that fell past his shoulders in a thick black rope. He was Cheyenne River Lakota, late 20s, lean and long-muscled from a life spent reading sign and following game across country that killed the careless. The Winchester model 1873, riding in its worn leather scabbard across his back, was a practical tool, not a trophy. The trade knife on his belt had been sharpened so many times, the blade curved slightly inward, like a sickle moon. He knelt beside a cluster of tracks, pressed deep into the alkaline dust bison, a small herd, perhaps 8 or 9 head, moving north toward what little water still pooled in the seasonal draws. He ran his fingers along the crumbled edge of one print, feeling how the fine dust had already begun to fill it in, reading the moisture content and the compression depth. 2 hours old, maybe 3, not fresh enough to follow in failing light. He straightened slowly, joints popping softly, and scanned the horizon out of long habit. That was when he saw them. A wagon sat canted at a broken angle at the edge of a shallow wash, one rear wheel shattered into splinters, the iron rim half buried in sand like a broken bone. The canvas top had been torn loose on one side and flapped weakly in the relentless wind, a pale flag of surrender. Beside it, on hands and knees in the dirt, were 4 figures that at first looked like scavengers picking at carrion. Chayton moved closer, angling his approach so the lowering sun would not throw his shadow ahead to startle them. As the distance closed, details emerged with painful clarity. A woman mid-20s, her calico dress so filthy and torn at the hem that the original pattern was barely visible. Blonde hair had escaped from a braid that had come half undone, hanging in matted ropes around a face burned red by sun and wind. 3 children, a girl perhaps 10 years old, with her mother's blonde hair, a boy of 8 with a shock of brown hair standing up in cowlicks, and a younger girl no more than 6, whose face was streaked with dirt and tears. They were digging with sticks and bare hands, prying wild biscuit root from the stony soil, and scraping dirt from the pale bulbs with cracked, bleeding fingernails. The children's lips were split and crusted with dried blood. The mother's knuckles were scraped raw pink flesh showing through torn skin. They worked in silence, too tired or too frightened to speak, moving with the mechanical desperation of people who had forgotten what it meant to be full. Chayton stopped 10 paces away, boots crunching on gravel. The woman's head snapped up one hand, moving instinctively to shield the smallest child. Her eyes were startlingly blue against the sunburn and grime on her face, pale as winter ice. Fear flickered there first, then calculation measuring him the weapons he carried the distance between them, and finally, something harder. Resignation maybe, or just exhaustion too deep to fight anymore. He did not raise his hands in peace or lower his gaze in deference. Instead, he extended one hand toward her palm, up fingers steady despite the wind. "Stand up," he said. His voice was low, roughened by wind and long silence. "Come with me." It was not a request, but it was not a command either. It was practical, the tone a man might use to tell another that a storm was coming or that the trail ahead had washed out. He gestured with his other hand toward the horizon where the last light was fading to purple. "Water and shelter before night, or you will freeze." The woman stared at him. Her gaze moved to the Winchester, lingered on the knife, then returned to his face. She was searching for something, mercy maybe, or honest intent. The oldest girl, thin as a willow switch, clutched her mother's arm with both hands. The boy tried to stand and swayed legs buckling beneath him. The little one just blinked, too weary to understand what was happening. Chayton waited. He had learned patience from his grandfather, who had taught him to sit motionless beside a waterhole from dawn to dusk until the deer forgot a man was there. He could wait as long as it took. The wind pushed at his back, cold and insistent, but he stood like stone. Finally, the woman reached up and placed her trembling hand in his. Her fingers were cold despite the day's heat, the skin rough with calluses and old blisters that had broken and healed and broken again. He closed his hand gently around hers and helped her to her feet. She swayed when she stood, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow, feeling the sharp bone beneath thin flesh. She smelled of wood smoke and sweat and the metallic tang of fear. He released her and turned to the children. The boy tried to straighten pride, warring with exhaustion in his hollow eyes. Chayton knelt and scooped up the smallest girl without asking permission. She was light as a sack of seed corn, barely any weight at all, and her breath wheezed slightly in her chest. The woman opened her mouth to protest, then closed it and nodded once sharply. Chayton started walking, angling northeast toward the faint trace that followed the dry creek bed. He shortened his stride so the woman and children could keep pace without running. As they moved through the deepening twilight, he placed himself between them and the open plain to the west, where coyotes had begun to yip and call to each other in the gathering dark, their voices rising and falling like ghostly laughter. The woman walked beside him, one hand gripping the older girl's shoulder and the other holding the boy's wrist. She glanced at Chayton once, and their eyes met for a heartbeat. Hers were full of questions she did not ask. His gave no answers, only the steady assurance of a man who knew the way and would not falter. Behind them, the broken wagon disappeared into shadow. Ahead, the first stars began to prick through the deepening blue, cold and indifferent. And between 4 people and 1 man walked into the failing light, bound together by nothing more than necessity and the single fragile thread of trust exchanged in a trembling handshake. The trace Chayton followed was little more than a scar in the earth, carved by wagon wheels that had passed this way in wetter years. Now the ruts were filled with drifted sand, and the grass on either side had gone brittle and yellow, rattling in the wind like old bones. He kept his pace steady, adjusting when the little girl's weight shifted in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, hot with fever. The woman, she had not yet given her name, matched his stride without complaint, though he could hear the hitch in her breathing and the catch in her throat each time she inhaled. The older girl, walking with her chin up and her thin shoulders squared, was trying desperately to look strong. The boy stumbled twice, but caught himself each time, jaw set, in a way that reminded Chayton of young warriors proving themselves on their first hunt, refusing to show weakness even when their bodies screamed for rest. They reached what remained of Crystal Creek, just as the last light left the sky. The creek was a cruel mockery of its name, now reduced to a string of muddy pools separated by long stretches of cracked clay that looked like broken pottery. Chayton knelt at the largest pool and tested the water with his fingers, then tasted it carefully, rolling it over his tongue. Alkaline, bitter with minerals, but not poisonous. He nodded to the woman. "Drink slow," he said. "Too fast you will be sick." She helped the children kneel at the water's edge. They drank like desperate animals, cupping their hands and slurping frantically, water running down their chins and soaking their ragged clothes. Chayton let the little girl down, and she crawled forward on hands and knees, dipping her whole face directly into the pool. The woman pulled her back gently, murmuring something too soft for Chayton to hear, and helped her drink more carefully. While they drank, Chayton scouted the immediate area, moving in widening circles. 100 yards upstream stood the remnants of a line shack burned out months or perhaps years ago. 3 walls remained blackened timbers leaning inward like the ribs of some great dead animal. The roof was gone entirely, leaving only the stone chimney still standing solid and defiant against the sky. It would have to do. He returned to the creek and gestured. "Come." They followed him to the shack without question. The woman stopped at the threshold, staring at the charred interior, where ash still lay thick on the ground. For a moment he thought she might refuse, that some final reserve of pride might make her turn away. But then she stepped inside and looked around with the same calculating gaze she had turned on him earlier, measuring angles and shelter and possibilities. "It will keep the wind off," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "Better than nothing." Chayton went back to the broken wagon. It took him 20 minutes of hard work to wrestle the canvas top loose from its frame and drag it back to the shack, and the heavy fabric fighting him with every step. He rigged it across the open roof timbers, lashing the corners with rawhide cord from his pack, pulling it tight enough to shed rain, but leaving slack in the center so wind would not tear it loose. The canvas sagged in the middle, but held firm when he tested it. It would shed rain if any came, and trap what little heat a fire could give against the coming cold. The woman watched him work, then began gathering stones from the creek to build a fire ring without being told. The older girl, Lena, helped without being asked, carrying rocks nearly too heavy for her thin arms, her face set with determination. The boy tried to help, but sat down abruptly, dizzy and pale. Chayton caught him by the shoulder before he toppled sideways into the ashes that still lay thick on the ground. "Sit," Chayton said firmly. "Rest." The boy nodded, too tired to argue, and folded his legs beneath him. Chayton showed Lena how to dig a sunken fire hole with an air draw tunnel, a shallow hole with a tunnel slanting toward the prevailing wind, so the flames would draw air from below and burn hot without sparking dangerously or making much smoke. She watched with grave attention, her young face serious, then used a flat stone to scrape out the tunnel herself, copying his movements exactly. He nodded approval, and something like pride flickered in her eyes, the first light he had seen there. He built the fire with care, using dry grass and brittle sage stems, striking sparks from flint and steel, until the tinder caught and began to smoke. The flames grew quickly once they took hold, fed by the wind tunnel, and he added small sticks and then larger ones, building the fire slowly until it burned steady and low, giving heat without waste. From his pack he took a small iron pot dented and blackened with use, the handle wrapped in leather. He filled it with water from the creek, then added the wild biscuit root the family had gathered, along with a generous pinch of salt from a leather pouch. The salt was precious, traded from white men, but they needed it. He set the pot at the edge of the fire, where it would heat slowly, and waited, adding a few dried strips of venison from his pack to give the thin stew some substance. The woman sat across from him, the children huddled close on either side like baby birds in a nest. The little girl, Molly, had fallen asleep with her head in her mother's lap, mouth open, breathing raggedly. The firelight carved deep shadows under the woman's cheekbones and made her pale eyes look even lighter, almost colorless. "My name is Emma," she said, finally breaking the long silence. "Emma Vernon. These are my children, Lena, Arthur, and Molly." Chayton nodded once. Chayton. She waited, perhaps expecting more. A family name, a band affiliation, some explanation of who he was and why he was here. But he offered nothing else. And after a moment, she looked down at her hands, flexing her raw fingers slowly, as though testing whether they still worked. "My husband died 3 weeks ago," she said. Her voice was flat, drained of emotion by repetition or exhaustion or both. Fever took him. He was a surveyor, worked for a man named Vernon Pike. Some call him Bear Claw around here. Chayton stirred the pot, watching steam begin to rise from the surface, carrying the smell of cooking root and meat. "We were going to Bobcat Crossing." Emma continued, words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken. I thought I could find work there. Sewing, washing, cooking, anything. But the axle broke 2 days ago. We have been walking since then trying to reach the town, living on roots and what little water we could find. You came from where? Windmill Flats. We had a tent there near Pike's surveying operation. After Samuel died, they told us to leave within the day. Said the land was company leased, not ours. They burned what we could not carry. Chayton ladled the thin stew into a battered tin cup and passed it to Lena. She took it carefully, holding it in both hands, blowing on the surface before sipping. The heat brought color back to her cheeks. He filled the cup again and gave it to Arthur, then again for Emma. She drank slowly, eyes closed, and let out a shaking breath that might have been a sob. "Why did you help us?" she asked when she opened her eyes again. Chayton poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. "A man helped me once," he said after a long pause. "White man settler. 2 winters ago I was hunting elk. Ice broke under me. I went into the creek. Water was cold enough to kill. He pulled me out, gave me his coat, took me to his cabin, even though his wife was afraid. Let me warm by his fire. Did not ask why, did not ask for payment or trade. Just helped because I needed it. And that is why you help us now. Debt is debt." Chayton said simply, as though it explained everything. To him it did. Emma studied him across the flickering fire, her expression unreadable. Something in her face softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary, watchful. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Eat. Sleep. Tomorrow we reach the town." But Emma did not sleep, not right away. She sat awake long after the children had curled together under her threadbare shawl like puppies in a den, their breathing evening out into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. She stared into the flames, as though searching for answers there, her face hollow and shadowed. Once near midnight, a gust of wind tore at the canvas overhead and sent embers scattering across the dirt floor like tiny meteors. Chayton moved quickly, covering both Emma and himself with his buffalo hide cloak, pulling her close and down to shield her from the flying sparks. For a moment, they were pressed together in the darkness beneath the heavy hide, her breath warm against his collarbone. His arms solid and steady across her shoulders, the smell of smoke and leather and sweat surrounding them. Then the wind passed, and he released her and stepped back without a word, as though nothing had happened. Emma did not speak, but her hand went to her throat, fingers resting there as though feeling for her pulse, and she watched him with an expression he could not read in the dim light. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing coals that pulsed like a slow heartbeat, she reached into the deep pocket of her torn dress and pulled out a small notebook, its leather cover charred at the edges and stained with what might have been blood. She opened it carefully, as though it were fragile as a bird's egg, and ran her fingers over the pages filled with numbers and careful sketches. "Samuel wrote this," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Survey notes, measurements, maps. He hid it in the wagon, tucked it inside the wheel hub where I would find it. He told me just before he died. Her voice caught. He was burning with fever, barely conscious, but he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises and told me that if anything happened, this was the truth, that I should find it and keep it safe. Chayton looked at the notebook, but did not reach for it. "Truth about what?" "I do not know yet," Emma said, turning pages slowly. "But I think it has something to do with the water. He kept mentioning water rights, kept saying Pike was stealing something that belonged to everyone." She closed the book carefully and tucked it back into her pocket, pressing her hand over it protectively. "I will figure it out. I have to." She lay down beside her children, then pulling the thin shawl over all 4 of them, and finally closed her eyes. Chayton sat with his back to the stone chimney Winchester across his knees and watched the night. He did not sleep. Coyotes called in the distance, and once he heard the cough of a mountain lion somewhere up in the rocks, but nothing came close. When dawn finally began to gray, the eastern sky he stood and went to check their back trail. That was when he saw the dust on the horizon riders, at least two moving parallel to their route. They were being followed. At dawn, a figure appeared on the trace leading north, a white man in his 50s, riding a bony mule that looked half dead itself, and leading a pack horse loaded with canvas-wrapped bundles that clinked softly with each step. He wore a dusty black coat that had once been fine, a flat-brimmed hat. And when he dismounted, he moved with the stiff care of someone whose joints ached in the cold morning air. "Morning," he called while still 20 yards away, raising one hand slowly to show it was empty. "Name is Clement Beale. Folks call me Doc." Chayton stood slowly from where he had been crouched by the cold fire, his hand drifting near his knife, but not touching it yet. Emma sat up quickly, instinctively shielding the children with her body, all trace of sleep vanishing from her face. Doc Beale stopped 10 paces away and showed both hands palms out. "Easy now. I am not here to cause trouble. Saw your fire last night from the ridge yonder. Thought you might need help. Looks like I thought right." "Who are you?" Emma asked, voice sharp with suspicion. "Country doctor, like I said. I trade medicine for hides, pull teeth for settlers, set bones for whoever asks and can pay. I do not care what color a man is or where he prays long as his silver is good." He nodded toward Chayton with a slight smile. "I know you. We traded last spring. You brought me 6 deer hides, good quality for laudanum and willow bark. Your grandmother had the cough that rattles." Chayton relaxed, slightly remembering. "She is better now." "Good, good. That is how medicine should work." Beale looked at Emma and the children with professional assessment, his eyes moving from face to face. "You folks look like you have been through it, and then some. Let me take a look at those young ones, make sure nothing is broken or infected that might turn bad." Emma hesitated, maternal instinct warring with desperation. Finally, she nodded. Beale knelt in the dirt beside the children, his movements gentle and practiced. He checked their eyes and throats, pressing his fingers against their necks to feel for swollen glands, listening to their breathing with his ear pressed to their backs. He gave Molly a peppermint stick from his coat pocket, and her whole face lit up with wonder, the first real smile Chayton had seen from any of them. "They will be all right," Beale announced, standing and brushing off his knees. "Hungry and tired and dehydrated, but fundamentally sound. Strong stock. Get them fed properly and rested for a few days, they will bounce back. Children always do if you give them half a chance." "We are going to Bobcat Crossing," Emma said. "I need to find work." Beale's weathered face darkened, deep lines appearing around his mouth. "That might not be the safest place for you right now, ma'am." Why not Vernon Pike?" Beale said, as though the name itself was explanation enough. When Emma just stared at him, he continued. "Bear Claw Pike, they call him. He owns most of the range from here, clear to Red Rock, bought it, claimed it, or just took it depending on who you ask. Runs maybe 10,000 head of cattle when the grass is good. And he is squeezing hard right now. Drought has bled this whole valley nearly dry, and folks are starting to say Pike dammed up the creek upstream on his land. Word is his cousin Magnus was appointed Territorial Water Commissioner last year. Convenient timing, that. If you cross Pike or his men, you will have trouble. The kind that does not go away." Emma's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in her cheek. "My husband worked for him. For Pike." Beale went very still. "I know," he said quietly after a pause that stretched too long. "I was the one who signed Samuel Vernon's death certificate." Emma stood slowly, her whole body rigid. "You said it was fever." "That is what I wrote on the paper." Beale Beale admitted looking at the ground instead of at her. But truth is more complicated. Samuel came to me the week before he died, beaten badly. His ribs were cracked, face all swollen. He was scared, terrified really, in a way I had never seen in a man before. He told me he had been forced to write something wrong on a deed that Pike's men had beaten him and threatened to hurt you and the children if he did not sign. He said he was going to fix it somehow, that he was going to hide the truth where only you would find it. Beale looked up, his eyes moving to the pocket where Emma had tucked the notebook earlier. I think you have what he meant. But there is more. You should know something I have only recently put together. Samuel came to me twice that last week. The second time, 2 days before he died, he was carrying a small cloth bag. He asked me to keep it safe, said it was insurance. I put it in my medical kit and honestly forgot about it in the chaos after he died. I found it again yesterday when I was restocking supplies. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small canvas pouch, stained and worn. I opened it last night. It is black powder, maybe 4 ounces and a length of miner's fuse. Samuel must have taken it from Pike's operation. They use it to blast rock when they build water diversions. I think he meant it as evidence, or maybe as a tool if evidence was not enough. Emma pulled out the notebook with shaking hands and opened it. Chayton moved closer, looking over her shoulder close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body, despite the cool morning. The pages were filled with careful survey lines, coordinates written in neat columns, and rough sketches of terrain features. On one page near the middle, Samuel had drawn a detailed map of Crystal Creek as it wound through a canyon with a specific spot marked with an X and circled 3 times. Next to it, in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic toward the bottom of the page, he had written, Rock Crib Dam Illegal Diversion. Violation of Prior Appropriation Doctrine. Senior rights dated 1869 being denied. Pike Syndicate Dam constructed spring 1876 without authority. Evidence in main survey book, page 47. Weak point northwest corner, where crib meets canyon wall. Geological fault, unstable shale layer. Emma looked up at Beale, and Chayton saw tears standing in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. He proved Pike was stealing the water. That is what got him killed. And he left us a way to stop it. Yes, Beale said heavily. And I did nothing. I was afraid Pike would come for me next, so I wrote fever on the certificate and kept my mouth shut like a coward. I have been living with that for 3 weeks now, and it sits in my gut like poison. But I can help you now if you will let me. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the nervous stamping of Beale's mule. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice low and hard as iron. Then I will use this to stop him. I will make Samuel's death mean something. Chayton looked at her, really looked at her, and saw steel beneath the exhaustion, a core of strength that had not broken despite everything. I will help you, he said simply. Emma met his eyes, and something passed between them in that moment, some wordless understanding. She nodded once. Then we had better get started, she said. Bobcat Crossing was not much of a town, just 2 rows of weathered buildings squatting along a rutted street that turned to soup when it rained, and concrete dust when it did not. There was a saloon with peeling paint, and a sign that hung crooked, a general store with a false front twice as tall as the actual building, a telegraph shack that leaned to one side like a livery stable that smelled of manure and hay, and a small clapboard church with a crooked steeple that pointed accusingly at heaven. The wind pushed dust devils down the main street in lazy spirals and rattled the loose boards on the storefronts, with a sound like bones shaking in a box. A few horses stood hip-shot at the hitching rails, tails swishing mechanically at flies. A handful of people moved along the boardwalk, farmers in homespun, a woman with a basket, 2 children chasing a hoop. They all looked thin, worn down, pressed flat by drought and hardship. Chayton led the way into town on foot, Emma and the children walking close behind him. Doc Beale had ridden ahead an hour earlier to make arrangements, and he met them at the edge of town near a small house with a sagging porch and flower boxes that held only dead stems. Greta Langen runs the school here, Beale explained, gesturing toward the house. German woman came out here 5 years ago to teach. Good heart, stubborn as a mule. She said the children can stay with her during the day, help with small chores in exchange for lessons and meals. It will keep them safe and out of sight while you do what needs doing. Emma looked at the house, then down at her children. Lena stood straight and tall, trying to look older than her 10 years. Arthur swayed slightly on his feet, nearly asleep, standing up. Molly clung to her mother's skirt with both fists, knuckles white. Go on, Emma said gently, kneeling and pulling them into a tight embrace. I will be back before dark. I promise. Be good for Miss Greta. Lena squared her thin shoulders and took her siblings' hands, leading them toward the house with the careful dignity of a girl forced to grow up too fast. The door opened before they reached it, and a sturdy woman in her 40s appeared. Greta, with gray-streaked hair, pulled into a severe bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She smiled and ushered the children inside, one hand resting gently on Molly's head. Emma watched until the door closed behind them, then closed her eyes briefly and took a shaking breath. Thank you, she said to Beale. Do not thank me yet. He replied grimly. Thank me when this is over and they are still safe. Chayton was already scanning the street, reading it like he would read a trail, who was watching, who was armed where the dangers lay. His eyes stopped on a group of men lounging outside the saloon, and his jaw tightened slightly. I need to send a telegram, Emma said, pulling the notebook from her pocket, to the Territorial Water Commissioner. If Pike is stealing water that belongs to everyone, the law needs to know. There are statutes, regulations. Prior appropriation doctrine says the first person to use water has senior rights that cannot be taken away. The law, Beale said with bitter amusement. The law is 300 miles away, ma'am. Out here, Pike is the law, and his cousin Magnus is the water commissioner. Then we make the law come here anyway, Emma said stubbornly. They walked together toward the telegraph shack, boots thudding on the wooden boardwalk. Chayton noticed people turning to watch them, some curious, some afraid, some with expressions he could not read. Inside the shack, which smelled of sulfur and hot metal and sweat, a young man with ink-stained fingers and bruises yellowing on his jaw sat hunched at the telegraph key. He looked up as they entered, and his eyes went wide when he saw Chayton. Help you? He asked, voice tight with nervousness. I need to send a message, Emma said, stepping forward. To the Territorial Water Commission office. No. The young man interrupted sharply. He glanced at the door, then leaned forward and lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. You do not want to do that. Not through normal channels. Sheriff Walt Sutter checks every telegram that goes out of here, reads them all. If Pike does not like what you say, you will disappear like smoke, like all the others. Emma went very still. Others? The young man, his name was Lucas Finch, he said, though folks called him Prairie Dog on account of how jumpy he was, nodded miserably. 2 farmers last year, a small rancher the year before, and a surveyor just 3 weeks back. He looked at Emma with pity heavy in his eyes. Your husband was not the first person to cross Pike, ma'am. He was just the most recent. Emma's face went pale, but she did not flinch or cry. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let him steal everything and get away with murder? Lucas scratched something quickly on a scrap of paper and slid it across the scarred wooden desk. You give me the message, I will code it into weather reports and stock prices. Mix it in with routine traffic. Might get through without Sutter catching on." He paused and then added quietly, "There is something else? Pike does not know this, but I have family downriver. My sister and her husband farm near Red Rock. Pike's dam killed their irrigation, and their children went hungry last winter. One of them, my nephew, just 4 years old, died of pneumonia because they could not afford medicine after losing their crop. So when I say I will help you, I mean it personal. I have been waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to Pike. I will do whatever it takes." Emma dictated the message carefully, and Lucas tapped it out in quick bursts, his hand flying over the key with practiced speed. When he finished, he tore the paper into tiny strips and fed them into the pot-bellied stove in the corner, watching until they curled and blackened and turned to ash. "That is all I can do for now," he said. "But if you need anything else, anything at all, you come find me, day or night." As they left the shack and stepped back into the harsh sunlight, Chayton touched Emma's arm lightly and nodded toward the far end of the street. A group of riders was coming, 6 men on horseback, moving slowly down the center of the street in a way that said they owned it and everyone on it. They were led by a tall, gaunt figure in a dusty coat the color of dried blood and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The man's jaw was sharp as a blade, his face hard and lined deep by sun and cruelty, and he wore a Colt revolver high on his hip in a dark, oiled leather holster, high on his hip on the leather oiled and dark with use. "Roman Dwyer," Lucas whispered urgently from the doorway behind them. "They call him Dusty Bill. He is Pike's foreman, does the dirty work, if you understand my meaning. You do not want to tangle with him." But it was too late to avoid him. The riders stopped directly in front of the general store, blocking the street. Dwyer dismounted with casual grace and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, then raised his voice so everyone on the street could hear him clearly. "Folks, listen up," he called out, his voice carrying like a preacher's. "Mr. Pike wants you all to know that the water situation has been clarified. All rights to Crystal Creek and its tributaries now belong to the Pike Syndicate, legal and proper. Anyone caught drawing water from the creek without written permission will be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent. That is the law, until the territorial authorities finish sorting out the claims. So you all best stay away from that water, unless you want trouble." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered: shopkeepers, farmers, women with children. An older woman with a basket on her arm and flour dust on her apron spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "That water belongs to everyone, always has. My husband filed a claim on it 10 years ago, back in '66. We got papers." "Your husband filed wrong, ma'am," Dwyer said flatly, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. "Bad survey, wrong coordinates? Take it up with the territorial office if you like, but you will lose. And if I catch you or yours at the creek before then, I will shoot your cattle dead where they stand and burn your field to ash. We clear?" The woman went silent, fear etched deep in the lines of her face. No one else spoke. Emma stepped forward before Chayton could stop her. "That is not legal. Prior appropriation doctrine means the first users have senior rights that cannot be taken by later claims. My husband was a surveyor, and he—" "Who the blazes are you?" Dwyer interrupted, turning to look at her with eyes like chips of flint. His gaze raked over her torn dress and dirty face with open contempt. "Emma Vernon. My husband was Samuel Vernon, territorial surveyor." Something flickered in Dwyer's eyes, recognition maybe, or calculation. His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on a friendlier face. "Samuel Vernon is dead. Fever took him, I heard. Real shame, that. Now, why do you not move along, widow, before you end up the same way? This is no place for women and children." Emma opened her mouth to respond, her face flushing with anger. But Chayton stepped smoothly between them, his hand resting with deceptive casualness on the handle of his knife. He said nothing, just looked at Dwyer with flat, emotionless eyes. Dwyer's smile widened, showing teeth stained with tobacco. Well, Lakota, are you? We do not see many of your kind in town these days. Heard the sheriff posted a bounty on Indian raiders, $50 for everyone brought in dead or alive. Maybe I should collect right now, save everyone some trouble. Maybe you should try, Chayton said quietly. The words were soft, but they carried a weight that made several of the gathered townspeople step back nervously. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across 3 feet of dusty street. The air seemed to thicken and heat. Dwyer's hand drifted slowly toward his Colt, fingers flexing. Chayton did not move at all, coiled and still as a snake about to strike. Then Doc Beale appeared, coughing loudly and theatrically, stepping between them with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Now, gentlemen. No need for trouble on such a fine morning. Dusty Bill, how is that shoulder of yours? The one you dislocated last month, still giving you grief when the weather turns? Dwyer's eyes stayed locked on Chayton for another heartbeat, then slid reluctantly to Beale. It is fine, Doc. Healed up good. Glad to hear it. You come see me if it flares up again. You hear I have got some new liniment works wonders. Beale turned to Emma and Chayton, his smile fixed and bright as paint. And you folks have business elsewhere, I believe. Let us go attend to it, shall we? Chayton backed away, slowly keeping his eyes on Dwyer until they were well clear. Emma followed, her hands still clenched into fists so tight her knuckles had gone white. They walked quickly to the far end of the street, where Beale ushered them into the shadow of the church. That was foolish, Beale said sharply, his false cheerfulness vanishing. Dusty Bill Dwyer is a killer bought and paid for. Pike keeps him on salary for exactly that purpose, scaring people and making problems disappear. He has killed at least 3 men that I know of, and that is just what people talk about openly. He threatened me, Emma said, breathing hard. Yes, and he will do a whole lot more than threaten if you give him cause. You need proof that will stand up even against Magnus Pike's corruption. Proof so clear that even a crooked commissioner cannot ignore it. Emma pulled out the notebook with shaking hands. I have proof. Samuel documented everything, including a weak point in the dam structure. Then we need to confirm it. Chayton said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. Go to the canyon, see the dam with our own eyes, take measurements, and figure out if what Samuel found can help us. When? Emma asked. Tomorrow morning before dawn, Chayton said. Before Pike's men are fully awake and watching. Move fast, get what we need, get out. That night, Emma sat with her children in Greta's small, neat parlor, while Greta made supper in the kitchen. The smell of frying salt pork and cornbread filled the room, simple food, but more than they had eaten in days. Emma held her children close, feeling the warm weight of them against her sides, and hummed an old lullaby her mother had taught her years ago. Molly fell asleep almost immediately, her head heavy on Emma's lap. Arthur and Lena fought sleep longer, but eventually their eyes closed and their breathing deepened. Chayton stood outside in the gathering dark, positioned where he could watch both the main street and the alley behind the house. Winchester in his hands, he became part of the shadows, nearly invisible. The wind carried smells from the town, wood smoke cooking food manure from the livery whiskey from the saloon. And underneath it all, the faint scent of rain that might be coming, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, and another answered. They left 2 hours before dawn the next morning, moving through darkness so complete that Chayton had to navigate by memory and instinct more than sight. He had scouted the route the previous evening while Emma was with the children, memorizing landmarks and checking for sentries. Now he led the way on foot Emma following close behind, both of them moving as quietly as they could manage. The wagon trace leading to the canyon was rough and treacherous in the dark, carved through broken rock and scattered with loose scree that could turn an ankle or worse. Twice Emma stumbled, and twice Chayton caught her arm to steady her without breaking stride. His hand was warm and solid, and she found herself leaning into the touch for just a moment before pulling away, her heart beating harder than exertion alone could explain. Chayton moved ahead frequently, scouting his moccasins absolutely silent on stone, while Emma's boots seemed to crack and scrape with every step despite her best efforts. He found tracks multiple times, fresh boot prints in the dust, still sharp-edged, and once the clear impression of a horse's hoof in a patch of sandy soil. Pike's riders had been through here recently patrolling. He signaled Emma to stop and wait, crouching in the shadow of a boulder, while he circled wide to make sure the way ahead was clear. The waiting was agony, every sound magnified, every shadow potentially an enemy. Emma's heart hammered so hard, she was sure anyone within 100 yards could hear it. Finally, Chayton returned and beckoned her forward. They continued climbing higher into the canyon as the sky began to lighten in the east, turning from black to gray to pale blue. As the sun rose, painting the cliff faces with light like liquid gold and orange, they reached a vantage point overlooking the canyon floor. And there it was, the dam. It was a massive structure far larger than Emma had imagined from Samuel's sketches, a rock crib dam built from heavy timbers and thousands of tons of stacked stone stretching across the narrowest point of the canyon like a wall. Water pooled behind it in a dark, still reservoir that must have been 20 feet deep, in places drowning what had once been a rushing creek. The water was then funneled through a complex sluice gate system into wooden flumes, long elevated channels made of rough-cut planks that snaked away toward the east, following the contour of the land, toward Pike's massive ranch holdings. Meanwhile, on the downstream side, where Crystal Creek should have been running strong and free, there was only a pathetic trickle seeping through gaps in the stonework. The creek bed was nearly dry-baked mud, cracked into geometric patterns, and dead fish rotted in the few remaining shallow pools, their scales dull and their bodies bloated. The stench of decay hung thick in the morning air, sweet and nauseating. Chayton climbed higher to get a better view, then whistled softly and waved Emma forward. She scrambled up beside him, breathing hard from exertion and altitude, her hands scraped raw from grabbing at rocks. When she saw the full scope of what Pike had done, she went absolutely rigid, her face draining of color. Samuel marked this exact spot in the notebook, she whispered, pulling out the small leather-bound book with trembling hands. She held it up beside the view, comparing the sketch to the reality before them. He measured it. He documented it. And look there at the northwest corner where the crib meets the canyon wall. Do you see how the stones are set differently? How there is a gap, almost like the structure is pulling away from the wall? Chayton studied the spot she indicated, his eyes narrowing. Unstable foundation, Samuel wrote about shale. A geological fault line, Emma said, reading from the notebook. He noted that the whole northwest section is built on a shale layer that shifts when it gets wet. The dam is holding now, but if enough water pressure built up, or if that shale layer became saturated, it would fail. Chayton finished. The entire structure would collapse from that corner. We need to document it, Emma said, already tearing a blank page from the back of the notebook. Draw what we see. Take measurements. If we can prove the dam is not only illegal, but structurally unsound, even Magnus Pike cannot ignore it. She began sketching rapidly with her stub of pencil, her hand remarkably steady despite everything. She drew the dam from multiple angles, noting the height, the width, the construction details, the sluice gates, the flumes, and especially the suspicious gap at the northwest corner. She estimated measurements using landmarks and her own knowledge of surveying principles Samuel had taught her. Chayton kept watch, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rim above and behind them. Minutes ticked past. The sun climbed higher. Then he saw them, 2 riders on the ridge to the north, backlit by the morning sun. One of them raised an arm and pointed directly at their position. "Down!" Chayton hissed urgently. "Now." They dropped flat against the rocks just as the first shot cracked across the canyon. The bullet struck stone 3 feet to their left, sending chips flying and leaving a bright scar on the rock face. The sound echoed and re-echoed, bouncing off canyon walls until it was impossible to tell where the shot had come from. More shots followed in rapid succession, and the distinctive crack of rifle fire, probably Winchester or Spencer carbines. Emma pressed herself into the smallest space she could find, while Chayton grabbed her wrist and hauled her bodily back down the slope, half dragging her behind a larger outcropping that would provide better cover. "The drawing?" Emma gasped. "I did not finish." "You finished enough," Chayton said flatly. "Move." They ran, scrambling and sliding down the steep trail they had climbed so carefully in the dark. Behind and above them, the riders spurred their horses forward, closing the distance, shouting to each other. More shots rang out. One bullet tore through the canvas water bag hanging from Emma's belt, soaking her dress. Another ricocheted off a boulder, inches from Chayton's head, with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil so close he felt the wind of its passage and smelled burnt rock. They reached the canyon floor where Emma had left Doc Beale's borrowed wagon, old and creaking but serviceable, and she scrambled into the driver's seat, while Chayton leaped into the back, already bringing his Winchester to bear. Emma seized the reins and shouted at the horses, slapping leather against their rumps. The wagon lurched forward, wheels bouncing over rocks and ruts. "Left!" Chayton shouted over the thunder of hooves and wheels. "Cut left through that arroyo." Emma hauled hard on the reins, sawing at the horses' mouths, and the wagon tilted dangerously as it careened into a narrow side channel choked with boulders and scrub. The wheels bounced and skidded, slamming against rocks, with impacts that jarred Emma's teeth and sent pain shooting up her spine. For one terrible moment, she was certain they would overturn. But then the wagon righted itself and plunged deeper into the arroyo. Behind them, the riders followed, but the narrow passage forced them to dismount and continue on foot, which bought precious seconds. One of them fired again, and this time the bullet punched through the wooden backboard of the wagon, with a sound like a splitting log showering splinters. Chayton fired back, not aiming to kill, which would bring immediate and overwhelming retribution from Pike, but to spook and delay. His first shot kicked up dust near the lead rider's boots. The man dove for cover behind a rock, cursing loudly. Chayton fired again, and the Winchester's report deafening in the enclosed space of the arroyo, and the second rider's hat went flying, and the man yelping and dropping flat. It bought them enough time. The arroyo widened, suddenly opening into a broader wash that led back toward the main trace. Emma whipped the horses mercilessly, something she would normally never do. But this was survival. The wagon shot out onto flatter ground, and suddenly they had room to run. The riders scrambled back to their horses, but by the time they cleared the narrow arroyo and remounted Chayton, and Emma had disappeared into the maze of dry washes and scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that characterized this piece of country. Chayton knew this land from his hunting, knew every draw and hidden trail, and he guided Emma through it with quiet commands, left here right at that dead cottonwood, straight through the gap in those rocks. They did not stop running until they were 5 miles away, hidden in a thick stand of cottonwoods near a spring that held only mud and algae. Emma climbed down from the wagon on legs that shook so badly she nearly fell. She sat heavily on a rock, wrapped her arms around herself, and shook silently. Chayton checked the horses first. Both were lathered and blowing hard, but unhurt. Then walked the perimeter of their temporary camp, making absolutely certain they had not been followed. Only when he was satisfied did he return to where Emma sat. She was staring at the half-finished drawing in her lap, at the careful lines and notes, at the proof they had risked their lives to gather. When she looked up at him, their eyes met and held for a long moment. Something passed between them. Gratitude, yes, but also a deeper recognition. They had survived together. They had trusted each other with their lives, and that trust had held. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, "for pulling me out of there, for not leaving me behind." "I would not leave you," Chayton said. There was something in his voice, a quiet intensity, that made Emma's breath catch. She stood slowly still, holding his gaze. For a heartbeat, they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat. Then Chayton stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned to check the horses again. But Emma's hand went to her chest, pressing against her heart. And she knew something had changed between them. Something that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the man himself. They rode back to Bobcat Crossing by a circuitous route approaching from the south, and arrived as dusk was falling. Chayton went directly to the schoolhouse while Emma retrieved the children from Greta. That night they gathered in Doc Beale's back room, Chayton, Emma Beale, and a fourth man Emma had not met before. "This is Silas Boone," Beale said, introducing a gaunt share farmer with hungry eyes and a desperate edge to his voice. "Pike has been squeezing him dry. His field is dying. His family is starving. He wants to help." "Why?" Emma asked bluntly. "Because I got nothing left to lose," Silas said. "Pike took everything already. Might as well go down fighting. Plus, I got a wife and 3 young ones who will not survive another winter like the last. If there is any chance of stopping Pike, I am in." Emma looked at the 3 men, this unlikely alliance of an aging doctor, a desperate farmer, a Lakota hunter, and herself, a widow with 3 children. Against Vernon Pike and his small army of hired guns, they were nothing. Gnats against a bear. But they were all they had. "We need a plan," Emma said. "A real plan. Going to the law has failed. Magnus Pike is corrupt. The townspeople are too afraid to act. So what do we do?" Doc Beale spread out the old cavalry maps. He had brought detailed surveys from his days as an assistant surgeon during the territorial campaigns. "These show the canyon system. Look here, overflow channels, secondary routes, places where water used to flow in wetter years before Pike dammed it all up." Chayton studied the maps intently, his finger tracing routes. "If the dam failed," he said slowly, "if the northwest corner collapsed, where Samuel noted the weak point, the water would pour through. Not a controlled release, but a full breach. It would destroy Pike's flumes, flood his diversion channels, and force the water back into its natural creek bed. The evidence would be undeniable. Everyone would see what Pike has done." "You are talking about blowing the dam," Beale said flatly. "Samuel left us the powder," Emma said, pulling out the small canvas pouch Beale had given her. 4 ounces. Is it enough?" "It might be," Beale admitted. If placed correctly at that weak point, Samuel identified it could trigger a collapse. The shale layer would do most of the work. We would just need to start it. But getting close enough to place the charge with Pike's guards watching. He shook his head. "It is suicide." "Unless we have cover," Chayton said. He looked toward the window where the sky was darkening. "Storm coming. Big one. I can feel it. If we time it right, use the weather, the confusion, it could work." "And if it does not?" Silas asked. "Then we die trying," Emma said simply. "But at least we try. At least we do not just roll over and let Pike win." There was a long silence. Then Silas nodded. "I am in." "So am I," Beale said heavily. "I owe Samuel that much, and myself." Chayton looked at Emma. "You should stay behind, with the children. Let us do this." "No," Emma said firmly. "Samuel died for this. I will not dishonor his sacrifice by hiding while others fight. We do this together or not at all." Their eyes met again, and Chayton saw the steel in her, the unbreakable core that hardship had revealed rather than destroyed. He nodded slowly. "Together," he agreed. Over the next 3 days, the storm built slowly on the horizon, thunderheads stacking over Wildcat Mountain like a dark promise. They made their preparations carefully. Beale acquired a long length of miner's fuse from a prospector who owed him for treating a bullet wound, no questions asked. Chayton scouted the canyon again, this time at night, and confirmed the guard positions and patrol routes. Emma studied Samuel's notes until she could picture the dam's weak point in perfect detail. Silas sharpened his old Spencer carbine and checked his ammunition. And Emma said goodbye to her children, though she did not tell them it might be forever. On the night of the 4th day, the storm finally came. They left at midnight, moving through darkness toward the canyon. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down like a hand, and lightning flickered constantly inside the towering clouds, turning the world briefly white, and then plunging it back into deeper darkness. Thunder rolled still distant, but growing closer. Chayton led them along the forgotten trail marked on Beale's cavalry maps, a narrow path that clung to the canyon wall used decades ago by Army scouts, but now overgrown and treacherous. They moved single file. Chayton in front, then Emma, then Silas, then Beale bringing up the rear. Each carried what weapons they had: rifles, knives, and the precious pouch of black powder wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The rain began as they climbed, cold and hard, soaking through their clothes within minutes. The rocks became treacherous, slick as ice. Emma's feet slipped twice, and both times Chayton's hand shot out to steady her, his grip firm and sure. The second time his hand lingered on her arm for just a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up, their eyes met through the rain. No words were spoken, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what might be lost tonight and what might have been if they had more time. Through gaps in the rain, they could see the dam below, a dark mass blocking the canyon water, pooling black and vast behind it. 2 guards stood visible near the sluice gates, huddled under a makeshift canvas shelter, miserable and not paying close attention to anything except staying dry. They used the old overflow channel marked on Beale's map, but choked now with brush to approach closer. It was a natural bypass that would have carried flood water around the dam in wetter years, carved deep into the rock by ancient currents. Now it was dry and hidden a perfect approach route. Chayton scouted ahead, moving like a ghost through the rain, and returned within minutes. He beckoned them forward, and they crept to a position just 50 yards from the dam, hidden in the rocks and rain. "There," Chayton whispered, pointing through the downpour. "Northwest corner, where the crib meets the canyon wall. That gap Samuel marked. We place the charge there against the shale layer. When it blows, the whole structure should collapse from that point." "How do we reach it?" Emma asked, studying the distance. "The guards will see us the moment we move into the open." "We create a diversion," Silas said. He pulled out a fusee, a railroad flare that would burn bright red even in rain. "I light this, throw it upstream past the dam. They see it, think someone is trying to approach from above. They go to investigate. You run for the corner place, the charge get clear." "They will see you," Chayton said. "Probably," Silas agreed. His voice was calm, accepting. "But my family needs this water. My children need it. If this is what it costs, so be it." "No," Emma said firmly. "We all get out or we do not do this. There has to be another way." But before they could debate further, lightning struck a massive bolt that hit the canyon rim no more than 200 yards away, with a crack so loud it felt like a physical blow. In the brilliant flash of light that lit up the world like noon, one of the guards looked directly at their hiding place. He shouted and pointed, raising his rifle. "Run," Chayton said. "Now, stick to the plan." Silas lit the fusee and hurled it with all his strength upstream. It arced through the rain like a falling star, bright red, and landed on the rocks well past the dam. Both guards turned toward it, instantly shouting to others. Chayton and Emma broke from cover and ran. The distance to the dam's northwest corner was perhaps 60 yards, but it felt like miles. Emma's boots slipped on wet stone, but she kept her feet through sheer desperation, clutching the oilcloth-wrapped powder against her chest like a child. Behind her, Silas fired his Spencer the boom, barely audible under the thunder. Not aimed to kill, just to keep heads down. Beale was beside him, doing the same with an old army Colt that kicked in his hand. Chayton reached the corner first and dropped to his knees, examining the gap where the crib met the canyon wall. It was just as Samuel had described, a fault line in the shale stones, stacked, but not mortared properly, the whole section pulling away from the wall by inches. Water seeped through the gap, and when Chayton pressed his hand against the shale, it crumbled slightly under pressure. "Here," he said urgently. "Right here." Emma unwrapped the powder with shaking hands. 4 ounces of black powder, grainy and dark. Chayton took it from her and packed it carefully into the deepest part of the gap, wedging it against the shale layer, then wrapped it with the oilcloth to protect it from the rain as much as possible. "The fuse," he said. Emma handed him the length of miner's fuse. Chayton worked it into the powder charge. His movements quick but careful. His fingers were steady despite the rain and the danger. Then boots pounded on the dam timbers above them, and a voice roared through the storm. "Stop right there." Dusty Bill Dwyer appeared through the rain, like an avenging demon coat, streaming water Colt in his hand. He fired once, the bullet striking the rock inches from Emma's head, and she cried out and fell backward. Chayton spun, putting himself between Emma and Dwyer's gun. He drew his knife in one smooth motion, the blade catching lightning light. Dwyer fired again. The bullet caught Chayton high on the left shoulder, spinning him halfway around. He went down on one knee, gasping, blood mixing with rain and running down his arm in dark rivulets. "No!" Emma screamed. She threw herself at Dwyer, not thinking, just acting on pure fury and fear. She hit him low, knocking his gun arm aside. They grappled Emma, fighting with wild desperation, clawing at his face, kicking at his legs. She had never fought anyone in her life, but rage and terror gave her strength. Dwyer grabbed her hair and yanked her head back, then struck her across the face with the barrel of his Colt. The blow opened a cut above her eye, blood streaming down into her vision. She fell dazed. Chayton surged back to his feet, favoring his wounded shoulder, and charged Dwyer from the side. They collided on the slick timbers of the dam itself, directly over the surging water. Chayton drove his knee into Dwyer's gut, then brought the hilt of his knife down hard on the man's wrist. The Colt fell from Dwyer's fingers and disappeared over the edge with a splash. Dwyer grabbed Chayton's wounded shoulder and squeezed. The pain was blinding. Chayton's vision went white and he staggered. Dwyer kicked his legs out from under him, and they both went down, rolling across the wet planks, grappling desperately. Meanwhile, more men were coming, guards drawn by the gunfire. Emma could see lanterns bobbing through the rain, hear voices shouting. They were out of time. She crawled back to the charge, found the fuse, and pulled out the flint and steel Beale had given her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip them. Once, twice, 3 times she struck them together, but the rain made it impossible to get a spark. "Let me," Doc Beale said suddenly beside her. He had left his position and run down to help. His hands were steadier, and on his second try, a spark caught. The fuse began to sputter and hiss, the flame eating its way toward the powder. "How long?" Emma gasped. 2 minutes, Beale said. "Maybe less. We need to run. Now." But Chayton was still fighting Dwyer on the dam, and Emma could see he was weakening, blood loss taking its toll. Dwyer was on top now, hands around Chayton's throat, choking the life out of him. Emma grabbed a loose timber from the ground, a broken piece of the dam's original construction, maybe 3 feet long and heavy as iron. She ran toward the 2 struggling men, raised the timber over her head, and brought it down with all her strength on Dwyer's back. The impact jarred her arms to the shoulder, but it broke Dwyer's hold. He arched back, roaring in pain, and Chayton bucked him off. They both scrambled to their feet, swaying exhausted. Then Vernon Pike himself arrived. He rode into view through the rain, flanked by Sheriff Sutter and 4 more armed men. Pike carried a Spencer carbine, its barrel pointed at the little group by the dam. "That is enough," Pike commanded, his voice cutting through the storm. "Everyone freeze where you are." Silas, still up in the rocks with his rifle, leveled it at Pike. "You shoot them, I shoot you." Pike did not even look up at him. "Son, if you fire that rifle, my men will cut you down before the echo fades. Be smart. Throw down your weapons, and maybe you all live through this." "We are past that," Emma said, wiping blood from her face. "You killed my husband. You have stolen from everyone in this valley. It ends tonight." Pike finally looked at her, really looked at her, and something almost like respect flickered in his eyes. "You are persistent, I will give you that. Stupid, but persistent. Like Samuel. He would not let things be either." He raised the carbine. "Step away from whatever you have planted there, or I will shoot you where you stand." "No," Emma said simply. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. And then, with a sound like cannon fire, the fuse reached the powder. The explosion was not large, 4 ounces, was not enough to blow the entire dam, but it did not need to be. The blast hit the shale layer at exactly the right point, the point Samuel had identified as the structure's fundamental weakness. The shale cracked, fractured, and began to slide. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then a grinding, creaking sound began to build, stone moving against stone. The northwest corner of the dam sagged, dropped a foot, then 2 feet. Water began pouring through the widening gap, not a trickle, but a torrent. "Run!" Chayton shouted, grabbing Emma's arm. They ran, scrambling off the dam and up the canyon wall. Behind them, the dam was coming apart. The gap widened as the shale layer gave way completely, and thousands of tons of water pressure found the weakness and exploited it. The crib timbers began to snap like toothpicks, the sound like gunshots. The whole northwest section collapsed inward, and the reservoir behind it began to empty in a roaring, churning flood. Pike spurred his horse forward, trying to reach higher ground, but the horse reared in panic at the sound and smell of the breaking dam. Pike fought the reins, cursing. Dwyer, still on the dam itself, tried to run. But his boots slipped on the wet planks, and when the section beneath him gave way, he fell with a scream that was cut off as the water took him. He surfaced once, arms flailing, then was swept downstream and disappeared into the churning froth. Pike's horse bolted, carrying him directly toward the collapsing dam. Emma saw his face in a lightning flash, eyes wide with shock and fear, mouth open in a shout that was lost in the roar. Then horse and rider both plunged into the gap, where the dam had been swallowed by the flood in an instant. Sheriff Sutter and the remaining guards scattered, running for their lives as the wall of water spread and surged. One man was not fast enough. The flood caught him and dragged him away, his screams fading into the distance. Chayton pulled Emma higher onto a shelf of rock well above the flood line. Doc Beale and Silas scrambled up beside them, all 4 pressing against the canyon wall as the water thundered past below. It was not the apocalyptic deluge. Emma had feared the dam had not failed completely, just the northwest section. But it was more than enough. The flumes downstream would be destroyed, the careful diversion channels overwhelmed and washed away. And Crystal Creek, for the first time in months, was flowing free. They clung to the rock as the rain intensified, as thunder crashed overhead, as lightning turned night to day and back again. Emma found herself pressed against Chayton's side, his good arm around her shoulders, sheltering her from the worst of the wind. She could feel his heart hammering against her back, could feel the warmth of his blood soaking through his shirt from the bullet wound. "You are hurt," she said, having to shout over the noise. "I will live," he said into her ear, his breath warm. "You had better," Emma said fiercely. "Do not you dare die on me now." She felt more than heard his quiet laugh. "I will not. I promise." They stayed on the ledge until the worst of the flood had passed and the rain began to ease. When they finally climbed down, the canyon floor was transformed. The creek bed, dry for so long, ran full and strong water spreading across its old channels, seeking the paths it had worn over centuries. The dam still stood, but it was broken useless, the northwest section, a tumbled mass of timber and stone through which the creek poured freely. And there was no sign of Vernon Pike or Dusty Bill Dwyer. The flood had taken them both. 3 days later, the storm had passed, and the sun returned harsh and bright. Crystal Creek ran true for the first time in months, water flowing clear and strong through the valley, filling irrigation ditches and stock ponds, bringing hope back to dried fields. Chayton lay in a bed in Doc Beale's office, shoulder bandaged and arm in a sling. The bullet had gone through clean, painful but not fatal, as Beale kept reminding him. Emma sat beside his bed, reading to him from a newspaper that had arrived on the morning stage. "Federal marshals arrived yesterday morning," she read. "Magnus Pike has been arrested on charges of corruption, malfeasance, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The investigation has expanded to the Territorial Land Office, where several other officials have been implicated. The emergency, the temporary drought order, was set aside on grounds of misconduct." She lowered the paper and smiled. "It worked. Samuel's evidence combined with what we did, it worked." "What about the dam?" Chayton asked. His voice was still weak, but his eyes were clear. "They are saying it was structurally unsound and failed during the storm. A tragic accident." Emma's smile turned wry. No mention of explosives or deliberate sabotage. Apparently, the authorities would rather not acknowledge that desperate citizens had to take the law into their own hands. "Suits me fine," Beale said from across the room where he was organizing medical supplies. Less attention means less trouble. A knock came at the door, and Greta entered leading Emma's 3 children by the hand. They broke free and ran to their mother, and she gathered them close, kissing their heads and breathing in their scent, soap and sunshine and life. "Mama, everyone is talking about how you fought the bad men," Arthur said excitedly. "They say you blew up the dam with explosives like a soldier." "We did what we had to," Emma said gently. "To make things right, to honor your papa's work." Lena looked past her mother to where Chayton lay, her young face serious. "You saved my mama. Thank you." Chayton nodded gravely. "Your mother saved herself, and she saved all of us. She is the bravest person I know." Emma felt heat rise to her face, and she looked away, blinking back sudden tears. The days that followed brought more changes. Sheriff Sutter resigned in disgrace and left the valley, no one mourning his departure. Lucas, the telegraph operator, was hailed as a hero for his coded messages that finally brought federal attention to Pike's corruption. Silas Boone's field began to green again now that water flowed, and his family no longer went hungry. 2 weeks later, Emma stood in the Territorial Land Office in Bobcat Crossing. which now had a new clerk, honest, appointed directly by the federal marshal to clean up the mess Pike had left. This was buried in the back of the old filing system. The clerk explained, handing Emma a document. Looks like Sheriff Sutter deliberately suppressed it. But it is legitimate, registered seal, proper witnesses, everything legal. Emma stared at the document. It was a deed of ownership for a spring parcel above Crystal Creek, registered in her name at the time of her marriage to Samuel. 20 acres, including water rights and timber rights, with a natural spring that would never run dry. Samuel did this, she whispered. He protected our future even before he knew he was in danger. Your husband was a good man, the clerk said simply. I am sorry for your loss. Emma walked out of the land office, clutching the deed, her vision blurred with tears. Samuel had given her this, a home of future safety for their children. Even in death, he was still protecting them. She went directly to the spring to see it properly. The land was beautiful, sheltered from harsh weather by rock walls, watered by a clear spring that bubbled up from deep underground and would never fail, even in drought. The old ash trees that grew there were strong, their roots deep, their branches spreading wide enough to shade a cabin and garden. It was perfect. She was standing there imagining possibilities when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Chayton, arm still in a sling, but walking steadily, carrying a bundle of cut saplings over his good shoulder and a rolled buffalo hide under his arm. You came back, she said, surprised and pleased, and trying not to show either too much. I said I would help, Chayton replied, simply setting down his load. A cabin needs building before winter comes. Thought you might need help. Emma smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. I might at that. Over the next weeks, the cabin took shape: walls of fitted logs, a solid roof, a door hung on iron hinges, windows with real glass. It was not large, but it was sound and tight built to last. Neighbors helped when they could. Lucas brought nails salvaged from an old barn. Greta donated blankets and dishes. Silas's wife brought seeds for spring planting. The whole valley seemed to breathe easier now that Pike was gone, now that water flowed freely again. Emma worked alongside Chayton every day, learning how to notch logs and chink gaps with mud and grass, how to hang a door so it would not sag, how to build a cold cellar into the hillside where food would keep through winter. The children helped too, carrying small stones for the fireplace, gathering kindling, learning skills they would need. And somewhere in those weeks, something shifted between Emma and Chayton. It was in the small moments, the way he steadied her hand when she was marking a cut line. Fingers wrapped around hers for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. The way she checked his bandages each evening, her touch careful and gentle, lingering on his skin. The way their eyes met across the work site and held conversations happening without words. One evening, as they were setting the main beam for the roof, Chayton showed her how to tie a specific knot that would hold the weight. He stood behind her, his arms around hers, guiding her hands through the motions. When the knot was tied, neither of them moved. Emma could feel the warmth of him at her back, could feel his breath stirring her hair. Emma, he said quietly. And there was something in his voice she had not heard before. Uncertainty, vulnerability. She turned in the circle of his arms to face him. They stood very close, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar on his jaw from some long-ago injury, the way his dark eyes reflected the setting sun. Yes, she said, barely breathing. When the cabin is finished, Chayton said slowly, carefully, I should go back to my people for the winter. It is expected, but... He paused, searching for words. I could return in spring, if you wanted, if there was a reason to. Emma understood what he was asking without asking. Her heart hammered in her chest. There would be a reason, she said. if you wanted there to be. I want, Chayton said simply. Then, very carefully giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the passionate kisses in dime novels. It was real, the press of his lips against hers, the tickle of his breath, the faint taste of coffee and wood smoke. His good hand came up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. When they parted, Emma was breathless. That was a promise, Chayton finished. If you will have it. I will have it, Emma said. I will have you. They stood together in the falling dusk, foreheads touching, and Emma felt something she had not felt since Samuel died: hope. Real, solid, tangible hope for a future that might include more than just survival. A future that might include partnership, companionship, maybe even love earned slowly through shared trials and mutual respect. On the day the cabin was finished, a cold, clear morning in late autumn, with frost sparkling on the grass, Chayton stood back and examined his work with a critical eye. The door, he said. You never said. Do you want it to face the creek or the morning sun? Emma studied the cabin, the land, the children playing by the spring. She thought about Samuel and all he had sacrificed. She thought about the fight they had won and the people who had helped. She thought about Chayton and the quiet promise they had made to each other. She thought about the future that was finally impossibly possible. Both, she said decisively. If we angle it right, we can have both. Chayton smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his usually serious face. Then that is what we will do. They adjusted the framing, repositioned the door's orientation, and when the cabin was finally complete, the door opened toward the southeast, toward the creek, with its life-giving water that now flowed free, and toward the east, where the sun rose new each morning, bringing light and warmth and the promise of another day. That evening, after the children were asleep inside under buffalo robes and wool blankets, after the fire had been banked and the door barred against the cold, Emma and Chayton sat on the threshold of the cabin they had built together. The wood was still raw, smelling of sap and newness and possibility. Chayton passed Emma a tin cup of coffee, real coffee, the good kind, and their shoulders touched as they sat side by side. The contact was warm and solid and right. They did not speak for a long time, just sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Montana sky. Finally, Emma said, "When you go back to your people, will you tell them about this, about us?" "I will tell them I found something worth returning to," Chayton said. "They will understand. My grandfather would have liked you. He always said the strongest people are the ones who bend but do not break." "I feel pretty broken sometimes," Emma admitted. "Broken and rebuilt," Chayton corrected gently. "Like a bone that heals stronger than before." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, and his arm came around her, holding her close. "Come back in spring," she said. "Please." "I will," Chayton promised. "I will come back, and next time I will bring materials to expand the cabin. Winters are long. You will need more space." Emma corrected softly. "We will need more space." She felt him smile against her hair. "Yes, we." They sat together as the night deepened, as coyotes sang their wild songs in the hills, as the creek murmured its endless song below them. Two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other by intention, bound not by grand declarations or formal vows, but by something deeper and more enduring, mutual respect, forged in crisis, trust earned through survival, and the quiet certainty that together they could face whatever hardships the frontier might bring. When Emma finally stood to go inside, Chayton caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. It was an old-fashioned gesture, courtly almost, and it made her smile. Sleep well, he said. You too, she replied. And Chayton, thank you. For everything. For my life, for my children's lives, for this. She gestured at the cabin, the land, the future. For all of it. Thank you for letting me help build it, Chayton said. It is the finest thing I have ever made. Emma went inside, her heart full to bursting. Through the window, she could see Chayton settling himself by the fire, outside Winchester, across his knees, keeping watch one more night to make sure they were safe. And she knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from surviving impossible things that he would keep watch for as many nights as they had. That when spring came and he returned, it would not be as a visitor, but as a partner. That the life they would build together would be hard, and this was frontier country, and hardship was guaranteed, but it would be honest and true and theirs. The next morning, Emma woke to find fresh snow dusting the ground, and Chayton already gone tracks leading north toward his people's winter camp. But beside the door, he had left a bundle wrapped in soft doe-skin venison, jerky dried berries, and a carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, its wings spread as though in flight. Emma held the little bird in her palm and smiled through tears. It was a promise, a symbol. He would return like the birds returned each spring break.